Good evening. I'm Allison Griffin, Senior Vice President with Whiteboard Advisors. We are a social impact agency based out of Washington, D.C. with colleagues nationwide working on issues related to education. I co-lead our post-secondary education practice and am based out of Boulder, Colorado. I'm thrilled today to have an incredible panel of colleagues to talk about issues related to safety and security, particularly for our LGBTQ students and learners in schools and at institutions of higher education. One of the things that I've admired the most about working in Colorado in education is the robust and collaborative and evidence-based policy environment. And I've found that Colorado is really leading the country in policy development, particularly around issues related to our LGBTQ plus youth. One short anecdote during the early days of the pandemic, I'm a mom. I have two middle school boys, and during the early days of the pandemic, my oldest son asked me for his birthday if he could please have a pride flag to hang in his room. And I asked him if he could tell me a little bit more about that request for a gift. And he said, "Mom, not everyone feels safe at school, and I want my friends to know that I'm an ally if they ever need someone to talk to about how they're feeling." And that moment struck me. And as our team started to talk about these issues that are incredibly pervasive across schools and communities in the country, moments when students and learners don't feel safe, it dawned on me that some of the things that are happening in Colorado could actually be a model for the country. And so today, in addition to our esteemed panel, we are incredibly grateful and excited to be joined by Governor Jared Polis. He's the 43rd governor of the state of Colorado. Governor Polis, you have been a both lifelong advocate and supporter of learners of all backgrounds. And I am thrilled to be able to be with you this afternoon to talk about what's happening in Colorado, particularly in the policy environment in support of our LGBTQ students.
Thank you, Allison, for that kind introduction and for organizing this important panel. Thank you to everybody tuning in today. I also want to thank Whiteboard Advisors for convening this important conversation, as well as your work to support students and educators. My fellow panelists, this has been a long 2 years for all of us, but we know that students and educators have all been impacted by the pandemic, and students went from having that connection to their peers and educators to having it put online and challenged overnight. That can lead to increased feelings of isolation and loneliness, particularly for LGBTQ youth that might not have that support network at home, that had looked to GSAs and schools for the support that may be lacking in their own family. Since I took office, we've made great progress. Not only has Colorado led the way in going back in person in school ahead of many states, we've also changed many laws making it safer for LGBTQ individuals to lead lives of dignity. Last year, we banned conversion therapy for minors, which is, where it's a form of child abuse, where parents force their kids without their consent into these programs. We also made it easier for transgender Coloradans to amend their gender identity on official documents, and a law addressing harassment of students based on sexual orientation and gender identity. We also finally took off the books the so-called LGBTQ panic defense. We expanded mental health resources for LGBTQ teens. We worked to ensure that LGBTQ Coloradans were counted accurately in the census. We also signed a law that for Colorado's veterans benefits, we consider those discharged dishonorably under Don't Ask, Don't Tell as honorable discharges with full veteran status. We should really draw from the progress we've made in recent years nationally: marriage equality, ending Don't Ask, Don't Tell. 20 different states, including Colorado, ban workforce discrimination against LGBTQ residents. The bill to do that passed the United States House as well. But of course, every day I'm reminded that there's still many battles fought when it comes to LGBTQ rights, especially for young people reliant on their parents. There's a gap between legal and lived equality for LGBTQ youth. And it's crucial that we continue our work with a holistic approach that empowers and improves the lives of members of every marginalized group. I understand the responsibility, and I'm proud, of course, to be the first openly gay governor in Colorado. But Coloradans aren't going to remember my time as governor because of who I love. They're going to remember it based on whether I'm successful in lowering healthcare costs, improving education, expanding housing opportunities that are affordable, growing our economy, and really, how we're judged. Most Coloradans really are going to look at every person as an individual, not as a member of a group. And that's why I keep fighting for policies that improve the lives of all Coloradans. And one example of that is our upcoming budget, improving funding for our schools, record increases to education, investment of about $526 per student. What that means is for a class of 25 kids, that's an additional $13,000. And it's up to local school districts how to use that, but it's a combination of increased pay for teachers, smaller class size, hopefully bringing back some of the enrichment programs and the arts that might have been cut during tough budgetary times. Also, very importantly, we're going to be making record investments in behavioral health. I'll be, for the first time in Colorado history, adding a member of my cabinet as the head of the Behavioral Health Administration. And we will also be providing more residential treatment for people overcoming substance abuse disorder and working to support the mental health needs of all Coloradans, including LGBT youth and people of all ages. There's a lot of work ahead. And I look forward to working with legislators and partners like Whiteboard Advisors and so many others to make the investments that matter and make the change that matters for all Coloradans, including our LGBTQ youth. All of it will take all of us working together to create real, positive, lasting change as we navigate the hopefully final days of this pandemic. But I'm more hopeful than ever before that our state is going to emerge even stronger, more inclusive, really celebrating a Colorado for all. And no matter where you live in our state, no matter what your family background, no matter who you love, no matter who you are, our state is a place for you to live up to your fullest potential. Thank you so much for the opportunity to address you today, and I'll turn it back over to Alex.
Wonderful. Thank you, Governor Polis, both for your leadership and your time with us this afternoon. Really appreciate you sharing a few moments with us, and I'm definitely grateful for both your leadership in the state and the legacy that you will leave in Colorado. I am excited to turn our conversation over to my colleague, Hillarynutson, who will introduce our panel and guide our questions through the rest of the afternoon. Hillary.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you to Governor Polis for joining us today. I think hearing directly from him about the successes in Colorado, I think those of us that are familiar to the work are well versed in the many successes. But I think hearing how LGBTQ+ students have been prioritized in Colorado and the significant legislative action it's just remarkable. And Colorado is really leading the nation in mental health supports for minors. And we know that has been an exacerbated need for our youth, especially those that identify as LGBTQ+. I know that our audience is eager to hear from our esteemed panelists today. So I'm going to take a moment to introduce them and then want to hear directly from them on how this is a changing landscape and what policies and practices can really make a difference here and in supporting our students. So I'm joined today by Dr. Darren Jones. Darren leads strategic initiatives and partnerships in the higher education space for Cognito. Cognito designs really cool role play simulations that help students as well as the adults supporting students and educators to create that culture of care and the mental health and belonging that the governor was also talking about. Levi Erickson joins us from Denver Public Schools, where he serves as the program manager for LGBTQ+ initiatives, as well as a leader on the team for culture and equity for Denver Public Schools. Thank you again to our panelists for joining. And first, I would love to start with Levi. I want to hear about the district perspective, especially as we think about supports within K-12. Denver Public Schools is a leader within Colorado being a leader. And in 2018 and 2020, I know DPS passed resolutions that were related to ensuring the safety and inclusion of LGBTQ+ students. Of course, we know policies are one step forward, and it doesn't always equate to practice or solving problems, certainly. So I would love to hear more about how these resolutions have informed and influenced the culture in Denver public schools and how you think other districts can replicate on those successes.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Hillary, and thanks for having me. Hello, everybody out there. Denver Public Schools, through these two resolutions, but also through the practices that have happened for many, many years previous to these resolutions, we make really clear our commitment to our LGBTQ plus students, staff, and families. And really what these resolutions do is make these efforts more public, more known, and they're also something we can really connect back to when there's resistance to this work, which there definitely is. So I think, I'm thinking about this in two different ways, in terms of culture and then also in terms of practices. And when I think about culture-wise, what's kind of shifted to make more inclusive and safe spaces for LGBTQ plus students and staff, I think something we've really done in DPS over the last couple of years is really the elevation of LGBTQ plus topics into equity work and kind of reducing those silos in terms of marginalized students. So really looking at the intersectionality of students and the different needs and supports that they have. One way that we've really done that I'm really proud of is this year for the first time, or last year in 2020, we were able to collect data, DPS specific data on LGBTQ plus students, so we could really find out what was happening for our students. Some other things we've seen in terms of culture with DPS is a really broad adoption of pronoun sharing, adding pronouns to signatures, using introducing pronouns in meetings and in classrooms. We've also kind of started district-wide using gender support plans, which is a great document that the organization Gender Spectrum created. And so I highly recommend that. Another thing that we've really seen that is kind of a direct result of the 2020 resolution is a lot more symbols of pride around the district. So trans flags and pride flags and pronoun pins and things like that. And then when I think about practices, I'm really thinking about things that have really elevated the safety and inclusion of our students. And so, I think while I'm in this position and I have this title, I really want to say there are a lot of folks in DPS who are lighthouses now and in the past that have really been uplifting and pushing this work so that we are able to kind of accomplish a couple of things that I'm super proud of. And the first thing is last year we made an update to Infinite Campus. So students could self-select from 5 genders. They could also add a pronoun flag. We also streamlined some ways that students could update their names on remote platforms. The shift to remote learning really sped that up because we have students who may not go by the name that shows in something like their Schoology, which was kind of a minor problem before remote learning, but then became a major problem. And so that was part of it. And along with that, we updated registration packets for students this year so they could add a pronoun, their sex assigned at birth, and then their gender identity. And so just keeping doing that. And then of course we passed our all gender restroom mandate in January of 2020 that said all schools need to have one single stall, all gender restroom. COVID kind of has slowed that process down, but that's kind of where we are. And then just quickly, like thoughts I have for others, you definitely need administrative support and buy-in. So school leaders, superintendent, senior leadership that needs to be bought in. There needs to be the same message from top to bottom that this is a priority and we're not going to bend on it. And finally, just really thinking about pulling in your partners, whether you're in a district leadership position or if you're outside, finding inside partners and making sure that those partners are diverse, that there's community input, just making sure that when you're asking for community input or you're looking for ways to be more supportive, that you're really looking at the diversity of communities, language, race, ability, things like that. And finally, don't be afraid of pushback. You'll get it, prepare for it, but don't be scared. That's kind of what I got.
That's it. And then we're set up for success. No, Levi, that is so helpful. And there are so many things, so many points that you've made in there. And I can see Darren like aggressively nodding along. So I hope everyone else sees that Darren is just like +1 to all of these points. But I think you both noted things that were exacerbated by COVID and hybrid and virtual learning, or things that might have been slowed down by hybrid and virtual learning. And I think that just also speaks to the changing landscape and how quickly things are changing within this policy and legal landscape. And so providing that safe space, I think a lot of this work is built upon the relationships that students have within their school buildings. And that doesn't stop at K-12, right, Darren? That also extends into our higher ed institutions. I know this is the work that you love. So tell us about the higher ed space. What does this look like for you, especially as the pandemic ramped up?
Yeah, and I absolutely love that question because it acknowledges that, number one, support systems do exist, right? So no one is sitting on their hands saying, we don't care, we're going to ignore. But it also acknowledges that support systems need support as well. And when we think about that, yes, there are programs and there's been affinity spaces that have been created on university campuses to create those safe spaces, which is amazing. Faculty and staff is the largest support system, that exists, right? You have hundreds of thousands of people that really have a role in creating that sense of belonging. And so what happens with me as a Black gay man, let's say I'm a student, go to a faculty or staff member about my identity or even issues in connecting to that university environment? How can faculty and staff use those moments so that I feel seen, heard, and a valued part of that community, right? And a part of that is feeling safe in being who I am or who I have yet to discover. And most importantly, whatever that means to you, right? So, and the additional information, it could challenge individuals on their paradigm shift because what we see is what we do, and what we do is what we get, right? And so there is a direct correlation to how we see these opportunities, because a paradigm shift, an inclusive paradigm shift, would allow you to see the opportunities within policies, within the programs, within the procedures that are designed, or are supposed to be designed to support students, right? But when you start to think about through that identity lens, who are policies, the programs supporting? And who is not being supported at the same time. So I get excited about that because the support is in empowering those faculty and staff members to lean into these moments to create that sense of belonging. And it's uncomfortable, right? No one's saying that people are excited to have these conversations, but they're so essential because we think about growth mindset. We're thinking about this opportunity for elevation, for additional support, right? We are leaning in and pulling people into the conversation. And that is where the shift in demand really has come when it comes out to support for LGBTQ identified folks. I see you look like you're about to respond.
I know. No, I'm not going to interrupt. No, I have a follow-up question, but keep going.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, where I was going with that is the focus has been on elevating, upskilling faculty and staff members to be able to have these conversations because it's important that we lean into these moments because that's where the heart is. And that's what we want to do when we're creating these spaces. As Allison mentioned, her child said, I want to be a safe space for someone to come and talk. And that is so transformative for a lot of individuals. And then the next level is, okay, LGBTQ identified folks, then there's that secondary identity. So what we are also seeing is this focus on intersectionality, right? Because how people live their identity and how they experience the world is impacted by secondary or third identities, right? And so I will say that upskilling, that's where we really have shifted towards. Of course, that's why I love Cognito, because it focuses on that upskilling.
Absolutely. Yeah. And growth mindset, right? That you have to meet people where they're at. And I think, Levi shared, right? You can't be afraid of pushback. And to Zayn's point, this is a completely different conversation than it was, a year ago, certainly. So Darren, can I put you on the spot for a spotlight? What is something that you've worked on recently and in this last year where you're like, wow, that was really successful. This is something that I can really see the transformative action taking place. A lot of stories, so I'll pick your brain.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories, but so we use our learning methodology and our simulation technology that we use for mental health, so upskilling in that arena. And we saw or really heard and experienced a lot of demand to apply that to inclusive conversations, right? And so the most recent project that we're releasing this this month actually is called Cultivating Inclusive Communities. So how do we pull people into those moments where you can identify when harm has been done, or if there's an implication on someone's feeling of safety and security, and how do you facilitate it in a way that allows them to see the impact of words? So that intent and impact is very powerful. I remember I mentioned that growth mindset, and taking all of that in to see, okay, well, these are opportunities where I can really build this relationship, but also elevate someone's sense of self at the same time. And that's everybody's responsibility, whether or not you work in the dining hall, or if you're the chair of a department, or if you work in financial aid. They all interact with students, and this transcends, higher ed is in K-12. This is in life in general. So we're talking about general life skills on how do we, care for folks, but also make sure that everyone they feel ownership over their existence, and they feel comfortable being themselves in their true authentic self, right?
Absolutely.
And
right.
still thrive and flourish.
We have to show up as our whole selves. And that is exactly what we all get to do in our work. But that we know is not true for everyone. And I also think of then, Levi, as you have students that have experienced safe and inclusive environments and these communities, maybe they end up at an institution that Darren's talking about, but maybe they end up at an institution that doesn't have the same community or the same supports that they've become accustomed to. How do we think about that transition? How do we think about how we prepare students when they might be going somewhere where they will need more support?
I think that supporting students to be advocates for themselves, working on that skill. If depending on the relationship you have with a student, if you know where the student is going, supporting them, and looking around the area, what are the supports, who are the people there? But I think, part of this work is working with the next generation of folks who will one day be us, who will one day be us sitting on this call, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And so how do we, at least for myself as a queer elder, like, how do I think about how I'm working with students to be able to empower themselves? And if something isn't there, how do you support them to start something, right? And so I think that, our students aren't deficit, and our students aren't victims. LGBTQ plus students aren't victims. And they are powerful. And so I think really cultivating that power can be really important. And I think sometimes out there's a narrative that LGBTQ plus students are victims, or they are struggling. And the statistics are gloomy. And I don't disagree with that. And I think we need to think about, in terms of positive youth development, how are we lifting up students before they're standing on the edge of a cliff? And I think, that's something we can do.
No, absolutely. I think it's an excellent point. And I think Darren has also pointed to what happens when they do have those successes, right? When we do provide that community and that engagement. I think see another question coming in, that there's, when we're also thinking about supporting students, when we're thinking about ensuring that they can note that their pronouns or what their preferred name is and those things, and not every district, not every school is equipped for that. But it also introduces a lot of challenges and what we've seen in the shift to virtual, and of what does that mean for protecting students when maybe home isn't a safe space as well. I open this to the whole panel. How do we ensure student safety while also maintaining their school record of how do we communicate with parents? I think, Levi, you have the traction on the ground, but want to open it to everyone if you want to start. Yes, Levi can start. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting question. And, I think that comes really down to policy in districts. So in DPS, we do not require parent consent or parent permission for a student to change their name. In Infinite Campus, if they don't change their name in Infinite Campus or use a different pronoun and they're not out to their family for any reason, we do not out them to their families. We don't know what our students are going home to. And so I think that can be I think that can be a tricky situation, but ultimately here in Denver Public Schools, our mission is students learning, is keeping students thriving. And I think that when we're putting students first, which is one of our shared core values, we are thinking about what does this student need to thrive at school, and then how can we work to provide those supports at home.
Darren, on the higher ed side, as we're meeting that of like coming out of COVID, play on words there, I guess, coming out at all. Then what is thank you. What does this look like for Cognito and the work that you all do in this space? How has there been an increased need in the pandemic? Has what you offered changed? Can you just give us your perspective on that? What higher ed expects and is doing?
Yeah, definitely. So I mentioned that, that focus on upskilling, right? And it's this transition. There was the phrase in higher education of student-centered, right? They're the center of everything. Yes, but it's set up for certain students to be centered and others to be out, right? No pun intended, right? So now we're focused, transitioning into student ready, right? So what does it mean to be student ready, and who is the institution ready for? And what you'll find is there's also this transition from this idea of a best practice. Once you think you've done it, you automatically lost, right? Because the generations are shifting. What we're learning more and more every year, every event, right? And so the one piece of advice, or even that nugget, is what if we listened to their voices? We don't have to go in a room and in a chemistry set and figure out this concoction. They will tell you what their experiences are, and they will tell you what they need. Do they have the platform? Do they feel empowered to do so? And do they have the platform? And after they speak, where do their voices go? What value do we place on their existence so that what they say means something and is translated into tangible outcomes, right? So I'll connect that back to where Cognito sits in that, right? Is how do you use that moment to really empower individuals? So giving them the space to do that is one thing. Sitting in that moment in all of your identity, whatever feelings you have, and still giving voice is a skill. And that's why it's so important for people to be focused on those skills, even if you don't identify, right? But you value the person. And if you value the person, then it'll change your mindset on, okay, when I think about this policy, who is this for? Who is benefiting? Who is not benefiting? And how can they benefit? We have to consistently do that all the time. There's no point where we have made it. We're not there. We need to continually make it for all of our students, specifically LGBTQ students, and I would say specifically Black LGBTQ students, right? As we start to think about all the intersectionalities about that. All right, so that's my TED Talk.
Absolutely. Sometimes we just have to get out of the way and let the kids show us the way. They are smarter than many of us give them credit for, and they know they are also wiser beyond their years. I think one thing that Darren said and that Zayn also double clicked on was the idea of student voice. What are students telling us? I think right now, as we're in we've had 3 rounds of stimulus funding, right? Districts are trying to figure out how to spend billions of dollars, right? Districts have submitted their ESSER plans. What does it include? How are districts incorporating student voice in those plans, right? I spend a lot of time talking to state and district leaders, and being formerly serving at the state level, the importance of engaging students in what is happening to them and around them. They should be a part of those conversations. Levi, I'd love to hear from you how you support student voice, how students are engaged in this work, because with all of your silent snapping, I have a feeling there's some more to say there.
Yeah, I mean, I work really hard to include student voice. What I think is important, what I think matters is like a 41-year-old white person, is maybe not the thing that is important to our students. And in saying that, we're in a district with 207 schools, 5 different regions. And so really looking at things as regional and specialized and localized and trying to support students in their spaces, but also kind of being up on this, you know, not a higher level, but the viewpoint of the whole district to say, okay, you know, what is needed kind of in the meta, what is needed in the micro. And so I've done that in a couple of different ways. Like I said, we collected student data for the first time in March of 2020. Yes, that was in March of 2020. And so for the first time, we gave students an opportunity to self-identify. It was not required, but we found out we have a lot more LGBTQ plus students than the national average. And we have about 6% of students who replied identify as non-binary or transgender. And so that was interesting data. We also had an open comment section where students could say what we could do to help make schools more LGBTQ plus inclusive. So we got a ton of responses. I feel like it was like 500 responses or something like that. And then last year during the pandemic, I did virtual visits to different GSAs all across our regions to just sit and listen to students and to find out what was happening for them in their spaces. Of course, a little bit skewed by the pandemic. And I also want to say that, you know, for me and my work, it's also important to me, something that I learned, and that was that I also need to be going to other clubs like BSAs, Latinx Voices, right? Because GSAs are sometimes not the most intersectional spaces. And so it's kind of—
Tell us what GSAs are for those of us.
Gay Straight Alliance, Gender and Sexuality Alliance, Rainbow Clubs, but really listening.
And I don't want to lose that point either of the importance of then we have to go to multiple states. We have to show up where students are showing up.
Right.
And to Darren's point, this is about students of color and ensuring that students that are ticking all kinds of boxes, right, that we show up for them in the way that we serve them as well.
Yes, and I think that's a growth in my work, and I've been in this position for about 2 years, and I know that is still a gap. So
data matters, right? How we collect it, who we collect it from, what it says. Certainly been in the K-12 space, you know, for the last decade, and how we think about, you know, assessment, standardized assessment, when we think about student performance or lack thereof, and how we compare, how we contrast, especially amidst COVID and what that's meant for participation rates. And so I think there are many on this call that sit in a seat of a state or district leadership that are also thinking about that when we think of school ratings and how are we considering what students we're serving and how do we best serve them. One way that we can do that and can think about supporting is through professional development, right? Of how do we offer quality professional development? How do we know that it's working? And how do we ensure that it is meeting the needs of cultural sensitivity and intersectionality? Darren, I'm just gonna throw that up to you. This is
So when I look at the word cultural sensitivity, and I throw some other, not competing, but complementary things to think about. There's this idea, people take professional development to become culturally competent, you know, right? That idea of kind of like, I've taken it and I am super includer, you know, right? And again, once you put on that cape, who are you saving, you know, and via what? And how are you doing that? So we have to move to this consciousness. How are we constantly informing ourselves about culture, about populations that already exist on the campus, you know, right? And there's layers within that. So when we think about professional development, we think about you develop of the profession. So we're enhancing our skills to be better in our role. Is not just that hard tactical thing that's affiliated with your position. It's everything or who you impact, you know, right? So when we talk about of the profession, if your profession is to educate and support and to empower, you know, what information do you need in order to be better at doing that? So for faculty and staff, it may be inclusive teaching practices, right? When it comes down to those pedagogies and inviting people to share their pronouns, or inviting them to change their pronouns on the roster or something like that, right? But also, how does language reverberate when you have a binary and you're always referring to somebody as him and referring to like the doctor or the executive, you know, right? So those subtle ways and people's resistance to use pronouns. Like if I tell you this is how I identify, I don't care if I told you something different. last week. This is what I'm telling you now. So now it's on you to adjust because I am what matters to you, right? So we're thinking about you taking that data, as Zane was talking about, not letting it drive, but letting it inform, because data does not drive. I always tell people that data does not drive. It informs. And it's informing, again, those policies, those practices, those programs, the people, right? And how we're looking at this opportunity. So there's a number of different ways. Yes, there's going to be levels to it. So identifying where people are, and people they think they're further along than what they actually are, but that's neither here nor there. But what are those mechanisms for people to be aware of what their level of consciousness is? And can they exhibit the cultural humility to acknowledge that there's a lot more I need to know about? And I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to put myself in that uncomfortable space, to have those difficult conversations and be vulnerable, because that is where the growth is. And that's where a lot of professional development has to be, is breaking it down so that we can build up a new inclusive sense of self, right? And so that's where I'd say what professional development definitely should be focused on, is that introspection, right? So people know where they are, to know where they want to go.
Right. And you have to, it depends on where you're starting and where you want to go. And we want to ensure that, support everyone on their journey. I think to your point of like, things can change day to day, week to week. One of my dear friends is a principal at a school, and she was sharing similar stories, right? Of like, we just got to keep up with the kids and ensure that they are safe and comfortable. And part of that is not even part of that. So much of that is relationship driven, right?
Yes.
Like we talk about large scale PDs and plans and how we support at scale. At the same time, it's important to think about those relationships. And we recently actually released a white paper about student relationships and the importance of mentorship, especially amidst a virtual world, and highlighting that so much of that is driven by, I don't like to say non-academic, but the non-academic conversations that we have with students. And I think those are also important with our peers, right? It's not, that's when you get to know someone, that's when you get to support, get to figure it out. Because in interviewing middle school teachers, it is a hot topic. I think we have a few more minutes, and I want to make sure we're getting some other questions in the chat as well. I do want to pose an open question to everyone. We've shared a lot. This is amazing. I'm so excited that we were able to do this today. But we've also pointed a lot of things that can be done or have been done successfully. Would love to hear from each of you. What are the things that are still missing? How can we better serve our students? What is it our institutions should be doing? You take it in any direction that you would like, but I would love to hear those final thoughts from each of you as well. And we can, do we have someone that wishes to start before I just call out one of our panelists?
Doesn't matter.
Well, Darren, you're already off mute.
Okay.
So
Okay. All right. So, and I will couch this as a consideration, right? And we think about the existence of policies or practices based off of what we see, maybe national news, and it forces you, right? So this is a good point before another major event happens, because that's what kind of sparks a lot of the evolution or elevation, or whatever you want to call it. But what does an equity audit truly mean in this context, right? And how is it going to, what is it going to challenge you to do? And how is it going to make you feel? And if it's uncomfortable, then that's good, right? So that framework of, okay, we're going to apply this to our institution to really analyze what is the experience. And that's from beginning, so recruitment, all the way to post-grad success. So looking at that entire journey of successfully transitioning students into, through, and out, and how are resources allocated to look at that, but also support some of the recommendations, if it's important to you, right? So I would say the number one thing is equity audits are so crucial and vital in today.
Right now.
Yeah.
And I think it does point out the areas in which we probably do need more support, right? That we have great things happening in Denver and across Colorado. And there are other places to spotlight across the US as well. At the same time, like I spent almost a decade in Tennessee, and there's a big difference between when you're in rural Tennessee and when you're in Memphis, or when you're in rural Alabama, or when you're in New York City, right? And so I think when we think about how do we communicate with parents, how do we communicate with communities that run the gamut on the political spectrum, on the education attainment spectrum, whatever it is, right? I think to Darren's point on intersectionality, we have to think about those other intersections as well. And I think, how do we support not just our students, but then also our educators and district leaders to be able to have those tough conversations as well. So I believe I'm setting you up for both your final thoughts and that question too.
Oh, wait. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to just say what I think needs to happen. And if I don't answer your question, then bring it to me again. I think a couple of things. I think there is sometimes I think we lack leaning into the complexity, but also kind of the simplicity of these issues, right? And I think sometimes, there are certain people in the world who don't want to look at the complexity of, for example, transgender students, right? And just to say, like, if this, then this, or this is unsafe because of XYZ, instead of really looking at like what is actually happening and who really is unsafe. And I think that's a really interesting point. But what I think really needs to happen, and this is not just about LGBTQ plus students, this is what I think is really important just in the baseline of my work, is to continue interrogating what counts as normal, disrupting heteronormative and cisnormative structures, which I think causes a lot of that hate and that fear. Questioning like heteronormative and cisnormative structures of like systems, structures, models of knowing and being, right? And deepening our understanding of a binary gender as a construct, as really colonial and tied up in white supremacy culture, and really examining kind of those deeper questions. I think we can have a lot of really great policies. We can work on pronouns, we can work on restrooms, we can do all of these different things, right? But I think until we disrupt the heteronormative and cisnormative bias of the world that we live in, we're not really addressing that ground level. And that's really deep work. It's very subtle work. In some ways, it's very intangible and it's harder to touch. But I think that's something that would be useful.
It's a great point. And I think it also speaks to making decisions closest to the student, right? That this is also about, right, how that these are not necessarily new issues, right? There might be issues where we've turned up the volume. There might be reasons where they rise to the top, like to Zayn's point with the Supreme Court case, right? There are different catalysts that might drive the conversations around this. At the same time, supporting transgender students in schools is not something that has only been around for the last few years, right? Even if that's part of what
Right. And
conversation has been, and like, how do we support, how do we ensure those supports for all students? It's not just then about policy, it is about putting students first and that individual student as well.
Right. And I think that, the students are not the problem, right? Our society, the societies we live in are the problem, right? And so if there's a fear about something, I would address that, but that is not the student, right? And I think those are really important things to acknowledge, right? It's not controversial to talk about people. Transgender children are not a threat to other people. I'm a transgender person. I don't feel that I'm a threat to other people. I'm not a child, but I used to be. And so I think, yeah, really digging into those systems and structures can be really useful.
Absolutely. Thank you. I can't believe we only have 2 minutes to go. This has been so much fun. I would love to hear what the last thing, 30, like one sentence, what's something that you are optimistic about as we go into 2022? And we'll go in reverse order. So Levi, Zayn, Darren.
I am really looking forward to my work to continue boldly supporting LGBTQ plus students and lifting up LGBTQ plus inclusion, visibility, joy in Denver Public Schools and beyond.
I'm very much excited to continue to leverage technology in creating these safe and supportive communities, right? And so the innovation is moving so rapidly, and there's so many different ways that can contribute to a lot of the outcomes that we're seeking when it comes down to the sense of belonging. So definitely look forward to seeing what is going to come down the pipeline, because something new is probably going to be created tomorrow. But continuing the evolution of the simulation technology that we use, which is an innovative way to upskill faculty and staff, and in higher ed and K-12. So look forward to continuing that work.
Thank you so much. I can say I am extremely optimistic just based on meeting the three of you and having this conversation today. There's so much to point to that are bright spots. Colorado, unsurprisingly, is leading the way. There's a lot of opportunity here, and there's certainly a lot of work to be done, but thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Allison, for kicking us off, and thank you again to Governor Polis. We are so glad all of you could join, and we look forward to many more opportunities in this space.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Hillary.